Hello and welcome back to another episode of, what is now our name podcast, is Jim and Parker's excellent podcast.
Whoa. Totally.
And I think today, and if you have a new idea for what we should call our podcast next week, let us know about it. Comment, subscribe, at least whenever we get a Facebook page set up for that.
Precisely. But that's the title we're sticking with right now. So.
Yeah. And hey, who knows? It may stick for longer. And I think just kind of to hop into today's film, we are looking at a classic, but kind of an interesting classic. It is, originally called Raiders of the Lost Ark, but you probably know it better as Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, in 1981, it was released simply as Raiders of the Lost Ark, which I think if you were an audience member in 1981, you saw the poster with Harrison Ford and saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, but you thought, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Even the studio thought it was a bit of a head scratcher, but of course, Indiana Jones as a character and Raiders of the Lost Ark very quickly became a benchmark in popular cinema.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it made Harrison Ford really like the main actor he was, because obviously he had done Star Wars in the original trilogy before this. But this film was pretty much like his pedestal to stand on. This was his performance that made him the household amazing action adventure hero he is today. And really, when you look at this movie, it's kind of interesting because even from rewatching it as we just did, it's interesting because it doesn't kind of show itself as a big action adventure saga like we think about the other Indiana Jones films, where there's these huge production values and it's kind of a fun adventure. This was actually not only a fun film, but it was an Academy Award-winning film. It won 5 Academy Awards at the 1982 Oscars, has great effects, and is really kind of a classic film. And I think that goes back to really where the film came from in its history and what Lucas and Spielberg were trying to do with it.
And a lot of people nowadays tend to throw George Lucas under the bus, especially when the prequels came out. People started to criticize his writing, and even before he was booted out of the franchise by Disney, tried to force him out. But people tend to forget that Star Wars and Indiana Jones were essentially his ideas. Or not even essentially, they were his ideas. He came up with Indiana Jones around the same time he was writing the screenplay to Star Wars. But he decided at the time that he wanted to do Star Wars first, and so he put Indiana Jones on the shelf and went off and, of course, created Star Wars, and Star Wars became the highest grossing film of all time up to that point, even exceeding his own expectations, which he admits were very low. And he and Spielberg are part of this generation. They were the first generation really to thrive in the postmodern era of film, which was after the original filmmakers had all had their prime and disappeared after the studio system. These were people who were students of film in schools at USC and the like, who grew up with sort of these films from the 1930s and 40s. Particularly George Lucas based both this and Star Wars on Flash Gordon and the Republic serials of the 1930s and 40s. So they were very much in that mindset when they were making the films. Like, they remembered films that they really loved. And George took it a step further because he helped give it a higher budget. At the time, he could call his own shots after the success of Star Wars and even after The Empire Strikes Back. And the funny thing is he and Spielberg discussed this on a beach in Maui, because George did not want to go to the premiere of Star Wars. He had such a bad time making it that he took a vacation with Spielberg, and of course they got the word that Star Wars was going to be the next huge blockbuster. And in typical fashion, they basked in that for about all of 5 minutes and started proceeding to what they wanted to do next, as filmmakers are wont to do. And Spielberg had not been allowed by Albert Broccoli to direct The Spy Who Loved Me. And of course, he went on to do Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But he had always wanted to direct a Bond film. And George said, I've got that beat. I've got something much better. Mm-hmm. It's called Raiders of the Lost Ark. And the main character's name is Indiana Smith. His original name was Indiana Smith, but Spielberg said, I love the concept, and I love all that. I don't like his name. And Lucas says, okay, what about Indiana Jones? Spielberg says, yeah, that's good. And thus, they were off to the races, developing the script with Lawrence Kasdan, who was the next big thing. He had written Empire Strikes Back and would go on to write The Big Chill and a lot of films with Kevin Costner. But this was very early in his career. He had a lot to prove.
And hopping back to the Steven Spielberg a bit, because with that, Spielberg was kind of at an interesting point in his career right now. Obviously, just done The Spider Who Loves Me, and it wasn't one of his best films.
It wasn't The Spy Who Loved Me. It was 1941 came after.
Oh, 1941, excuse me, that's right. And with that, it was a very big production. The budget was going everywhere. It was kind of all over the place. And studios were becoming a little wary of Spielberg, because this was not uncharacteristic to him, where he would go out and really overspend in these films. And I think he was kind of becoming a little bit more of a high-risk target and director for making these big productions that weren't always panning out the way that they thought they were.
Well, the thing about that is Jaws and Close Encounters had run severely over budget and over schedule. But by the end of it, it seemed that the ends had justified the means, because both films were massive successes. And he became a household name. But 1941, in retrospect, I watched it again a few weeks ago. It was on TV, and it really isn't one of his best films. I'd put it probably in like the bottom 5, in fact, which is really, it sounds a little harsh, but Spielberg always makes at least a quality movie. This one was a very visually sprawling film. I mean, it looked interesting, but it had nothing to back it up. So when the film bombed, the studios were very hesitant to hire him again, whereas Lucas, of course, is one of his best friends, and he essentially chose Spielberg, and Spielberg begged George to take this project. And so again, it was a risk, and it was also a risk because George said he could do the whole movie for $20 million, which after Empire and his other films seemed like pennies. And the studio that ultimately took this on was Paramount. And they said, okay, if Spielberg can stay under budget, we will release the film. And sure enough, Spielberg was under budget and under schedule. So it reestablished him as somebody who, yes, can work in a time frame and work with a budget and create something on par with the money he had spent on Jaws and Close Encounters.
Yeah, which is really impressive when you think about it, because this movie also, just kind of from like the sense of it, it doesn't seem like a big production. Like there are moments in it that almost look like, I hate to use the word cheap, but it kind of was like that. It was very bare bones. They didn't have a lot of extra frills to go with it. And despite that, it's an amazingly shot film. Like you said, if you could make an Academy Award category, you would make it for B-roll footage or
second unit.
Second unit.
And we'll discuss that a little later when we talk about the action sequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And it won the Academy Award for special effects in '82. Like
it did,
which is amazing to think that a movie that feels so bare bones and just like minimalist, it was able to capture such great moments and use it to the most of its benefit.
And when we talk about the look of the film, both the cinematography and the sets, the idea for both men was to shoot it very much like the Republic Studios serials, which was very fast and not cheap enough that you can tell, like some productions where it's just like, oh, that's a really bad set. These are amazing sets, but they weren't really harped upon. They didn't shoot all that long in them. They captured only what they needed for coverage. And they just used very clever lighting to make the sets look more impressive than they probably were if you were to visit the sets, which were in England at Elstree Studios.
A lot of the same, it was the same location they used to do a lot of the Star Wars films. And you even notice that. You'll notice that there are some of the same actors that were in the Star Wars original trilogy. The sound effects are pretty much the same.
It's Ben Burt doing the sound for these two.
Yeah, and so you can obviously tell there is a not direct correlation, but
sort of a shared feeling.
Exactly, a very shared feeling and shared spirit with this film as well.
Yeah,
especially A New Hope, I feel like.
Yeah, especially that the production designer Norman Reynolds worked under John Barry, who had done the original Star Wars, and he carried on for Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And in this case, it seemed a logical choice for Lucas to ask him to build the sets, which were much different from Star Wars, obviously.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But it was still sort of the same kind of sense of amazing atmosphere, despite it being, quote unquote, a silly idea. But still, to have this kind of realistic atmosphere, and props to the British Art Department for doing it on both films, for making the thing feel real and used. Like this, it almost looks like it was shot in real locations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When a lot of it wasn't.
And so I think kind of to bring it back, we haven't really talked about the plot of the film yet, which is kind of funny because this movie is so popular. You would think almost everyone's seen it.
It seems, the word I would use is it's ubiquitous. It seems ubiquitous that people would know the plot, but we will, just before we get too far into the review, is... So the main story of the film concerns archaeological adventurer Indiana Jones, played by Harrison Ford. And there's an opportunity for him to find the Lost Ark of the Covenant, which leads him on a wild, globe-trotting chase because he has to beat the Nazis to find the Lost Ark. And along the way, he encounters thrills, spills, chases, and he encounters an old flame of his, Marion Ravenwood, played by Karen Allen.
It's fantastic.
And it's a race against time to see who will get the Ark first.
Mm-hmm. And it basically just sums up the whole movie right there.
That's pretty much it. It's a very simple plot, simple adventure plot, looking for buried treasure, which is the stuff of a little kid's dreams. Little kids love looking for buried treasure, artifacts, even looking in their backyard, pretending they're going to find a buried treasure with an X marked on it. And that's even a plot point in Last Crusade.
Yeah. It's like X marks the spot.
I think that's one of the reasons why the film resonates with both children and adults, is that kind of adventure, the sense of adventure that you can go off, you can fight the bad guys and look for treasure.
Get the girl at the end of the day.
Yeah, get the girl. That's why these movies really work, is that really simple idea, but just executed flawlessly by Spielberg.
Yeah. And so I think kind of to then talk about, obviously we talked about Harrison Ford already and Karen Allen, who's like the two main roles in this, but Harrison Ford wasn't the first choice for this, actually, because I think at the time Spielberg and Lucas were a little worried that they didn't want to keep making Harrison Ford like their main actor they went to. Obviously he'd been with them in Star Wars and also in American Graffiti. And so they didn't want to they didn't want him to always be their actor they went to and just roped him into it. Kind of like Scorsese and De Niro a little bit, which we talked about last week in Gangs of New York. Yeah. They had changed up with DiCaprio working with Scorsese in more recent years. So they originally wanted to get Tom Selleck in as it, but he was wrapped up with Magnum P.I., but did audition for it.
He did audition, and on the special features of the DVD, you can actually see some glimpses of it, and he's quite brilliant. Mm-hmm. Even with his mustache, he actually played him very well. Yeah. But CBS had preempted him to star in Magnum P.I., so they were without a star. And Spielberg secretly wanted Harrison to begin with because he saw something in Harrison that was more of an everyman kind of ruggedness. Yeah. He wasn't a typical... When you really get down to it, Harrison Ford is not your typical leading man. He's
not your typical Hollywood actor.
He's very much like Gary Cooper in the sense that he wasn't a trained actor at all, but he has this instinct and he has this sort of everyday quality about him. Like when you see him speaking to Marion for the first time in years, he has this really sheepish smile on his face, and he sometimes can't look her right in the eye, and that's not what you expect from this kind of a swashbuckling kind of hero. You expect him to be very dashing, and he can be sometimes. He can have that charm, but you can tell that this guy is very down to earth, very grounded. Mm-hmm.
Which is just perfect for Harrison Ford because even when you watch Harrison Ford, even nowadays, where he's like 60, almost 70 something. Yeah. When you see him give interviews, he's very curt. He doesn't like being there. He is not like a Hollywood star who loves being in the limelight. He really is just like there for making movies, for the actual production and the art of it.
Yeah, he loves what he does. He doesn't like the the frills of Hollywood.
No.
And even on this film, he was very eager to do as much as he could by himself, or at least as much as the insurance company would allow. There's a couple stunts in there where I think if he tried it, the insurance company would have grabbed Spielberg by the neck and said no.
And they're like, you let him do what?
Yeah, but fortunately for him, he had a great team of stuntmen behind him, and he had the confidence of working with Steven Spielberg, who he had not worked with before. Mm-hmm. He had worked with George, but he had not worked with Steven, and they both immediately liked each other. And you can see that there's a big difference between how he performs as Han Solo with George and how he performs as Indiana Jones with Steven. There's a much bigger sense of confidence about his performance and knowing where to land, where to stand, how to read it. Because Steven has that knack for directing actors that even I admit George doesn't always have.
Mm-hmm. And you can see that with like the later Star Wars trilogy.
You can.
Like the actors don't really know what to do, which I think that's some awkward.
But in the old days, he cast actors who could act their way out of a box, whereas some of the actors he cast in the newer films couldn't. Whereas Steven, even though Steven in his early days was criticized for not really being an actor's director, somehow he always has this ability to get the best out of anybody. Even if anybody is not a particularly great actor or somebody on Harrison's level, he can get a great performance. And this is what we get with Indiana Jones. Mm-hmm. It's not just because of the action, the cool action that he does, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
There's one thing I noticed in the rewatch when they're talking about the city of Tanis with the government officials, he lights up like a little kid who's gotten the best Christmas present of his life. He says the Nazis have discovered Tanis, and he's smiling. He's kind of hopping on his toes a little bit.
Yeah, he's pointing
excited.
Enthusiastically.
He's excited. The Harrison Ford point. Conan O'Brien ruined that forever for me. but and then later you see that he can be a little rough around the edges. He can be nasty, or he's ready to shoot somebody if he has to.
Mm-hmm. Which also leads in this character, like we kind of imagine Indiana Jones as this like sparkling hero, but he's quite dastardly actually. Like he's a bit of a drunk at certain times, which who isn't? But there's also moments where he's willing to kill and kind of like not cheat, but bend the rules in order to win and get what he needs to get done.
And in the end, even though he wants his finds, his archaeological finds in a museum, he's still a grave robber. So
yeah, and I actually
technically speaking, he's still a grave robber.
When I was in my freshman year at USD, I went to the University of San Diego where I got my degree. I took an archaeology class my first semester. It was one class I needed to take just to get credits and units. Right. And my professor, who's a very interesting professor, he talked about kind of like who in here has seen it, like Indiana Jones. I was only one of the few people who raised their hand in the class.
Oh, that's sad.
What's that? I was wow.
That breaks my heart.
I was like, God, you people have no culture.
as a cinephile, I want to cry.
I know.
But
and he's like, great. You've watched an abomination of what is considered archaeology.
Exactly.
And because you look at modern archaeology, obviously it's about detailing everything, respecting cultures, and like bringing in the locals and getting all the right like documentation and paperwork. Yeah. Whereas this, like, Indiana Jones is a grave robber. He's like, which granted, if you're going against the Nazis or anyone else, it's like, okay, I'd rather pick the other guy than the Nazis. But he's a bastardized version of what is considered archaeology, really.
That's true, but at the same time, in the old Republic films, or even the old B movies, which these are also based off of, somebody could call themselves a doctor or a scientist or an archaeologist, and they really aren't, like, the best at it. Mm-hmm. It's a very loose term, and they apply that here, that obviously he has a great love for archaeology, but at the same time he's not above stealing something out of a trap-laden temple, like at the beginning of the film. We should talk, now we're going to go through our list, because obviously my buddy here and I think that this may be one of the top 5 openings to a film.
It just sets it up perfectly. It
does.
Sets up the sense of adventure. It sets up kind of the camera work and the fast pace that's going to happen, but also like the slow kind of prodding moments.
Kind of the mystery.
Exactly.
Of what they're looking for.
It puts John Williams' amazing score just on perfect display with the fast pacedness, the adventure, but also the wonderment and kind of like a bit of fear and tension.
The excitement of discovery.
And it's just done perfectly. From the first segment where they're climbing through the jungle, where Harrison Ford is in the shadows the entire time, up until he whips a gun away from the guy, where he's revealed. They go into the temple and have to go through all these traps. And then, obviously, the golden statue idol. It's just been... I don't know. That has to have been lampooned by so many people.
So many times. Again, the word I use is ubiquitous because it's been mocked and parodied, sometimes with respect, sometimes with kind of Seth MacFarlane's kind of disregard kind of humor. Mm-hmm. That it feels like it's been around for so long. Similar to Star Wars, you can't imagine a time before this stuff that, especially our generation who was raised on this on the VHS tapes.
What's a VHS tape?
I'm gonna get you for that later.
That's you can buy it.
But of course, it all leads up to one of the most iconic moments in cinema, which is he turns around, he looks up, and he goes, "Oh no!" Like, oh, and this big boulder comes chasing after him again. That's right out of a B movie, and yet it's one of the coolest things you ever saw in your life.
Yeah, and I can't remember the first time I watched this movie. It must have been like early 2000s, but just seeing that instantly, it was stuck in my mind forever. It's like, that is one of the coolest things I've ever seen on film.
Exactly. And
it's so hard to beat. It's so original. It's so classic. And it's not the first time it was done, but it was done so well.
That it feels like it's the first time.
Exactly.
Right? It feels new.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's got to be. I can't think of other films off the top of my head where it's like great opening scenes, but that is just up there. If we ever do like a top 10, 20, whatever, that's going to be up there.
Yeah, if we ever do a list, that's going to be up there.
Yeah. And then eventually, kind of come back to America, then goes off to the Himalayas and Nepal.
Yeah, he gets his mission to find the Lost Ark.
Yeah, and it leads to the bar fight scene in the Himalayas, which is just so funny.
And where we're introduced to Marion Ravenwood, played by Karen Allen, who had recently made a splash in Animal House. Mm-hmm. And Spielberg liked her in that movie. He thought she had a lot of spunk.
Yeah.
And
that movie really put her on the map too. She was relatively unknown before that. We'll talk about Animal House another day too. But besides Belushi, all of those actors were unknowns.
Yeah, they really were.
That was like all of their big breakout.
Belushi was the only star because of Saturday Night Live, but all those actors got a break. Some weren't all that lucky, but a couple of them were.
Yeah.
And Karen obviously got a huge opportunity to star in this film. And she even said when she read the script, she was surprised that she was introduced in a drinking contest. And she drinks this big hulking Sherpa under a table. And the way she greets an old flame is not to be googly-eyed or just kind of fawning. Like a lot of female protagonists would have in this genre. What does she do? She goes up and punches him. Just punches him right in the face.
Which sets her character up perfectly. Like, this is... Like, she is not your typical, like, damsel in distress. Because I kind of made that point. It's like, it feels like at times she's a bit of damsel in distress. But then she'll, like, turn right around and, like, either shoot somebody or attack or help out in some way.
And I brought this up. It's similar to Princess Leia that she's a damsel, sure, but... And she could often be in distress, like she gets stuck somewhere or something happens and she'll ask for help, but she'll immediately turn around and be this tough woman, and it works perfectly.
Yeah. And of course it starts with the bar fight scene, which just has so many great moments. It starts off also with gunfire, the table getting burned down.
Actual fire
too, yeah. And then ultimately, I think, what's your favorite moment from it? When she grabs the stick of fire.
My favorite moment is she grabs the big stick, and they had shot holes into this keg of whiskey, and it's spewing out like an old cartoon, kind of falling to the floor. She takes a huge swig, just sticks her head under the stream, and takes a big gulp. And one of the henchmen, one of Toad's henchmen, one of the villains of the movie, he's standing there with a gun held to Indy and smiling, and all of a sudden she just whacks him on top of the head, and all you hear is a little ow. He falls down. Ow. He falls down. Just that little ow.
And then my favorite is someone comes behind, gets the drop on Indy, is kind of like holding him down.
Yeah.
And Toth, the like black, we call him the black coat henchman Nazi.
He says, "Shoot them."
Yeah. And
Shoot
then
them.
Indy looks, he's shoot them both. And the other intern just looks like, what?
The other henchman takes the gun that he's wrestling with Indy, and they both point at one of the henchmen with the machine gun, and they shoot him.
Yeah, talking about like, okay, you're not my enemy anymore. I don't care if he's paying me. I'm trying to live here.
It's a tiny moment of mutual survival technique just to shoot, and of course it leads into the main thrust of the second act, which is the recovery of the Ark in the Egyptian desert, and it leads to the famous Well of the Souls scene.
Yeah.
And there's so many great moments in this whole act of the movie. The second act is usually the act that nobody likes because it takes up most of the meat of the story, whereas this one really keeps things intriguing. It starts in the map room. Indy takes the headpiece, which helps identify the location of the Ark in this big map room. And there's no dialogue in the scene. And it's one of the rare moments in the movie where John Williams just gets to really let loose with the orchestra. And it builds the mystery and the anticipation of the location of the Ark. And Harrison Ford's acting is perfect in that scene. He's this wide-eyed kid, basically, looking for the Ark. And when it finally does, it shines this big beam of light, and it's perfect payoff. The Nazis are digging in the wrong place. The villains are the Nazis in this film, and they're basically figures of fun, really. They can be threatening, but mostly they're easily disposed, which is a topic for another day.
Yeah.
And then it leads to the Well of the Souls, which, of course, Sallah says the line. It's a perfect lead into the sequence because they open it up, and Sallah says, "Indy, why does the floor move?" Indy takes the torch, drops it in, and the camera tilts down to reveal the floor is covered in snakes.
Yeah.
Thousands of slithering, icky snakes.
And you just see Indiana Jones just peering down and then, with his fedora, and then he peels back, lying on the ground. He's like, snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Because it's established in this movie that he has a deep phobia of snakes. And of course he has to overcome that. Or rather, not overcome it, because that would be too simple. He has to basically
deals with it.
Force himself through the snakes. Like he falls down and he comes face to face with a open-hooded cobra, and
you see Harrison Ford's eyes just light like, oh,
like you see
my
true
God.
genuine terror in his face. And of course it opens up. They open up the hidden area where the Ark is, and the Ark is one of those great detailed movie props. It looks heavy. It's covered in gold leaf, and it's. What I love, too, is I noticed on this one is they open the stone, and automatically, there's no light source where they are. The Ark is kind of illuminated by itself.
Yeah. It's really interesting. There's also, I think, a fun kind of like tidbit on there as well, where I think there's like R2-D2 and C-3PO is like one of the hieroglyphics.
Yeah, one of the hieroglyphs.
It's very small, but if you
R2-D2.
pause the movie after they bring it out and you zoom in, like I think it's like the far right side, see it.
It is, yeah.
I forgot about that, but I just remembered it.
It's a great little Easter egg for people who like to find those.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things about this film that surprises me most is, I hate to use the word history, but there is like it's amazing how much detail is really put into the biblical references and historical kind of like timelines of everything. It makes you believe that this is a very plausible detail.
That's true.
Timeline of like what maybe actually happened to the Lost Ark of the Covenant.
And of course, the history is written to suit the movie's needs, but there's still a basis because this was an idea brought in early in development that it would be the Lost Ark of the Covenant, which automatically set up what would eventually become a trademark of the series. Is Indy has a flair for exotic artifacts or religious artifacts.
Yeah,
it would go to the Sankara stones in Temple of Doom and the Holy Grail in Last Crusade, and even the crystal skulls in Crystal Skull. But we may
talk about that one on a different day.
we really need to think about that one before we discuss it. But coming back to this, it leads to more. He's thrown into the Ark not the Ark. He's left in the Well of the Souls with Marion by the main villain of the movie named Belloc, who has a tendency to steal most of Indy's recovered artifacts. Like at the beginning of the movie during the opening scene, Indy escapes with this little golden idol, and Belloc is there waiting with natives and essentially forces Indy to hand over the artifact to him. And similar kind of thing happens here. He takes the Ark for himself and leaves Indy to die in the Well of the Souls with Marion. But of course, it's Indiana Jones. He finds a way out.
Yeah.
And it leads to both two, in perfect sequential order, two of the greatest action set pieces.
Like back to back.
Back to back.
It's really
in
awesome.
history. One is a fight with the airplane, the big flying wing against the big heavy.
Yeah, he's like the big, like this Nazi. He's like a pugilist, really. Like he comes up, he has this handlebar mustache,
bald handle, big pecs and big muscles, ready to fight Indy.
And he stands up like that old fighter stance. His hands are like his elbows aren't up, like his fists and wrists are over his elbows, just ready to like punch someone.
And another great thing about Indy is he can hold his own in a fight, but when he gets punched for the first, he lands a hit
square on his ass
on this guy, and the guy doesn't even flinch. Hits Indy in the face, and right down.
He's
just out.
Oof. Like you feel it's like, okay, this guy's probably got like 50 pounds on me. Like
exactly.
I'm in trouble.
And Indy, of course, escapes with his wits more than anything because he can hold his own in a fight, but he's smarter.
Yeah. Whereas this guy's just a big lucking
and
pile of
even.
muscle.
And Parker brought up this argument that Marion gets stuck in this airplane, but what I pointed out was, he says, she kind of turns into a damsel in distress here. And I said, but watch what she does after this. She immediately goes to the tail gun because there's a bunch of Nazi guards coming. She immediately goes to the guns and just mows them down.
Yeah.
She's resourceful, and she helps Indy and she helps herself, and that's really why I don't think she's much of a damsel in distress, because she can hold her own in a fight.
True. Maybe if she just didn't
she can
yell,
also think her way out.
If she didn't yell Indy right after like it closed, I probably wouldn't have made that comment, honestly. It's just like right after.
Okay.
It's like crap. Like
okay,
I don't know. Maybe that's just a tidbit.
I'll give you that.
But
I'll give you that. But of course, they get out of the airplane, and it leads into. I told Parker this multiple times during the sequence. My personal favorite action scene of all time, which is the truck chase. And this was this for me is a perfect example of filmmaking, because the scene has progression. It establishes what's going on. The truck is being driven away. Indy chases it on a horse, and he has to somehow get onto this truck. And this leads to George Lucas's original inspiration, which is what you found a lot in old style adventure films. He rides up alongside the truck, latches on, and leaps from the horse onto the truck. And it's a terrific stunt. And again, coming to the word ubiquitous, it feels so novel. It feels like it was always there, and it was. A lot of adventurers had done this in old films. But the way it's executed with the sound, music, and cinematography, it feels fresh and original.
And that's what I was going to do, because you mentioned the sound, and you pointed this out, there's a moment where Indy's like fighting off these Nazis, like pushing their cars off the side of the road.
Yeah.
But then one comes along the side of him and shoots his left arm in the driver's side. And then up until this moment, the music was very fast paced, like
very fast, very triumphant.
And then as that hits, it turns harrowing. It's like, our hero is vulnerable.
Yeah,
and then the guy comes in and starts wailing on him and actually throws Indy out of the windshield.
He's riding on the front of the bumper,
which is awesome.
The music builds like Indy's in trouble.
Yeah, which is just perfect. That's a perfect score. Like that's what music is supposed to do in films. It is supposed to build with the story and really give it more of that sense.
Underscore the action.
Exactly.
It's mostly referred to in Hollywood as underscore, but But again, we're going to get into John Williams after this segment, and it ends perfectly. It ends. Indy drags himself under the truck, just kind of crawls his way under the truck, holding onto the bottom, and gets dragged behind the truck using his bullwhip, climbs back on, and regains control of the truck and is able to escape the Nazis. I think a lot of this, we didn't talk about this before the review, but one of the big Oscars this movie won was Best Film Editing by Michael Kahn, who is Steven Spielberg's chief editor. He's been his editor since Close Encounters. He is one of the greatest editors of all time. And one of the reasons for that is even action at the time was either too fast or it was way too slow. Like, there was a lot of fast cuts for action to cut away from certain things. Whereas Michael Kahn has said in interviews that he edits from his gut. He doesn't think about, oh, well, I should cut it this way. I should cut this for this amount of seconds. I should cut it for that amount. He would always tell Spielberg, this feels right. Mm-hmm. And then, when you look at this sequence is perfectly edited.
Yeah. Especially because they have all that second unit footage, which is just fantastically done.
Which is right. Yeah, that's right. And they were able to marry the two units perfectly. And, of course, John Williams has that perfect soundtrack that we just talked about. Mm-hmm. That for me is the high watermark of action in the movie.
And I think we need to talk about the first part of the second act where they go to Cairo. I think we need to talk about that as well.
Yeah.
Where after the bar fight scene in Nepal, they then go to Cairo, and again, it's just a sense of wonderment for me. It's kind of magical. It's fun where they are looking over the rooftops of Cairo. And the score just kicks in, and it is just a gorgeous moment.
And it's our intro to Sala, played by John Rhys Davies.
Gimli!
he plays Gimli in Lord of the Rings.
Which is so funny, because he was the tallest, side fact, was the tallest guy out of all of the original guys, and then he became the shortest one of them.
Like, almost.
Not almost, but still, it's like, this dude was like 6'5".
And he has a perfect intro to Cairo, too, when Parker describes just the magic of being in this exotic city. Sala says, Cairo, city of the living.
He's just such a fun character. And
he is.
And I'll be honest, I think the Cairo stuff is honestly probably my favorite part of the movie, I think. It's just so fun. There's so many great moments. And you feel like the same sense of kind of thrill and suspense as any other part of the film. But they're in like a major metropolitan city, which I think is just kind of... It
feels tight.
Setting.
It feels tight, but also intimate at the same time.
Yeah. There's so many people hanging around in the marketplace.
And a lot of this was filmed in Tunisia when they shot on location. They shot in Tunisia. Mm-hmm. And sometimes in many of the same places where they shot Star Wars. But in this case, they shot in Tunisia and parts of Cairo, too, that weren't particularly well developed. And, of course... they said that the film crew complained of the water. The water often gave the cast and crew poisoning, like malaria and dysentery. And unfortunately, that happened to Harrison Ford on one of the shooting days. He came to work so sick. And you can see it in that particular shot when he goes up against the swordman. He's drenched in sweat, and he's kind of stumbling around.
Looks balmy. He looks like he just puked, honestly.
But they made it work in the film because he's been running around fighting people, and it would logically make him look tired. But there was this whole big thing where he would take the bullwhip and rip it out of his hands and go into another big brawl with the swordsman. And Harrison begs Steven, he says, "Can I just shoot this sucker?" And that leads to one of the best laughs in the movies.
Yeah.
He has
the crowd disperses. The big black, or dressed in black robes, this big swordsman flinging around this giant Arabian sword.
And Harrison has that look of, I have no time for this. Pulls out his gun, just bangs.
He just casually shoots him and he falls down. It's like, God, it's just hilarious. The great laugh.
It's so funny.
And then he turns around and is like, okay, who's next?
Yeah, he just leaves the shot. And it really is that was a combination of inspiration and practicality, because things change on sets all the time.
Yeah. And speaking of weapons, I also find it really funny that Marion's character, when she's running around, she grabs a frying pan and a guy pulls out a knife and she runs away, and then they go into a doorway and you just hear bong, and the guy falls out. I'm like, so apparently this is where Tangled got their inspiration from frying pans as weapons.
Tangled proved that pans and frying pans and skillets are a very capable weapon.
It's just so funny.
It was really funny.
And I think it kind of throughout the rest of the film, and you don't notice this as much in Cairo, but you notice it almost every other time. The use of shadows in this movie is excellent.
Yeah.
It kind of, there are multiple moments. There's the bar scene where you see Indiana Jones' silhouette. There's the scene in the Well of Souls where they're carrying the Ark through, and you see the two kind of winged figures at the top.
Yeah, the shadows cast on the wall. It's very much out of like film noir, using the shadows to help communicate kind of a sense of danger.
Yeah.
In some cases, and a sense of mystery. In the case of Indy and Sala carrying the Ark through the Well of the Souls, all you see are their shadows. It creates that sense of mystery about the Ark and kind of the sneakiness of what they're doing. They're doing it under the Nazis' noses. Whereas when the Nazis they're filmed mostly in backlight, which when you shoot in backlight, you create this kind of shadowy figure, almost a silhouette, which was very common in film noir. It was used for both the hero and the villain because the lines between good and evil were mostly blurred in film noir. Whereas in this case, the backlight was used on the villains, and Indy creates a great shadow with this because obviously he wears the great fedora.
It's iconic.
And leather jacket.
Yeah.
That was a stroke of genius from George Lucas, was to have him wearing a fedora.
And I think then after the Cairo scenes, they get the Ark back. They get back to Cairo and they get on the boat.
Right.
And obviously, at least one of the most the tender scene in the movie. There's a lot of action and suspense in this movie.
Yeah.
And sad moments, but there's only one tender scene in it, which is when Marion and Indy are in the boat after they got the Ark. They're trying to get back to England. And Marion's kind of taking care of Indy because he's so beaten up. He's been shot, kicked, punched.
Dragged by a truck.
Yeah, he's just worn down and tired.
And it's a great detail for the hero, too, because this was made in counterpoint, again, referring to Spielberg and Lucas's love for the Bond films. This was a counterpoint to those films because you never, in the old films, before the Daniel Craig era, you never saw Bond really wince in pain or deal with it. You never saw the hero licking his wounds. Whereas in this film, Harrison's struggling to take off his shirt. He's struggling to move. And when Sala says goodbye, he hugs him tenderly like an old friend, but it's hurting him, but he doesn't say anything.
Yeah.
And obviously Marion wants to help him. There's been a rekindling of their former relationship throughout the film, and this scene clinches it back. And he tells her to leave him alone. And she says, well, damn it, Indy, where doesn't it hurt? He starts pointing to places where it doesn't hurt, and she starts kissing them like it's so sweet. And he moves closer and closer, and he finally points to his lips and says, these.
Yeah. And he kisses, and then he's so exhausted he just falls asleep.
Yeah,
and
before anything can happen. And again, that's a beautiful moment by John Williams. He's built up this budding romance theme, like one of the great ones, similar to Superman. It starts very slowly, and you think it's just about to explode in this big orchestral flush like it would in the old movies, but it gets cut off as soon as Indy falls asleep. Yeah. And she says, we never seem to get a break, do we? Kind of sums up their relationship in a way, too.
It really does, yeah.
Yeah.
And I love that they don't really have flashbacks of what the relationship was. They allude to it in dialogue of that.
Yeah, you're given just enough.
And I really enjoy that. If they'd done flashbacks or something like that, I think it would have ruined it. We don't need it, which is, I feel like a tough time when you're a film writer that you want to give that audience, you want them to see those intimate moments of that budding relationship, but that's not what this movie is about. It's like the romance is a side part of it.
Just enough to develop your characters while still progressing the story along. And then, of course, it leads into the third act, which the Nazis once again get the Ark back.
Yeah.
And it leads into the revelation of what's inside the Ark.
Yeah. And really, I don't think we're going to spoil this movie. It's been out for 40 years. So
They open the Ark, and Marion and Indy don't look. Indy says to Marion, don't look at it. They shut their eyes. And when they open the Ark, there's this big swell. John Williams' amazing score. It's called The Miracle of the Ark, if you ever listen to the soundtrack. It starts really low, like there's steam coming out of it, like steam and smoke and
then
fog.
ghosts start flying
Ghosts
out of
fly
it.
around. And then Belloc is so completely enamored with what's going on, he screams, "It's beautiful!"
And then just like that, it turns for the worst.
Again, the music turns along with the visual. It goes from the ghostly face
It was like a beautiful woman.
All of a sudden turns into this skeleton and just goes, ah!
Yeah. And then the characters are like, they start screaming.
Dietrich, Tote, and Belloc just start screaming. And
some of their facial expressions are a little like goofy. Like,
well, that's fine. It's fine.
It's fine, but they're a little goofy. I'm just saying.
It's right out of a beaver.
It is. It fits it perfectly.
Stanley Kubrick made his actors pull more goofy faces than Spielberg ever could.
Sure, I will agree to that.
But and of course it leads to
everyone being killed. Like, it's a massacre.
Like lightning strikes the ground stormtroopers, the Nazi stormtroopers who are there with them. I think they actually got the better end of the deal because it leads into what many people think of when they think of Indiana Jones deaths or just iconic moments. Mm-hmm. The Ark does some weird stuff to Dietrich. Well, Dietrich's face implodes.
They literally have God's flame in front of them.
Yeah, it's God's flame in front of them. They're witnessing the power of God, and you're not supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
And Dietrich's face implodes. It gets shrunken in. Yeah, Totes is the more memorable because his face
melts away.
And it's gruesome as hell, but it's one of those moments where it's not like a horror film where you're kind of repulsed by it. It's kind of a, whoa, these guys are dying in the coolest way imaginable.
A little bit. And then there's also the funny part was that when you look at when Belloc
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, when Belloc gets killed, he's right in front of it, and the camera is looking just at his face. Like, you can't even see his shoulders.
Yeah,
and his head explodes. And when they originally had cut that, apparently they showed it to the ratings agencies, and they said, whoa, this is way too graphic. Like, this is going to get an R rating. And Spielberg's like, whoa, come on. Like, what are you talking about? Like, we literally have a dude getting chopped up by a plane. We have people, like, dead, like, skeletons.
Falling to their deaths.
Like, we have so much more stuff, and this is what you're getting pissed about?
And this is right after this guy gets his face
face
implodes, a guy gets his skin melted off. A head exploding was... For them, it was just like, oh, that's too much.
It was too much. And so in order to avoid that, they put, like, the flame effect in front of Belloc so that you can't see it as well. So apparently that made it all better, even though
that dropped it immediately back from an R to a PG.
Yeah.
But
this was also before PG-13 ratings involved.
This was before Spielberg kind of pushed that line. But again, that's the very memorable and climax of the film. And, of course... all the bodies are all disintegrated, and the Ark seals itself back up. Mm-hmm.
And then they go back to America and they hide the Ark, which is like one of the I think most iconic ending like shots of a film, where they they close the Ark up into a
crate,
wooden crate, and they put it away with all these other ones.
And you get this great pullback accompanied by a great matte painting too. When the camera pulls back and you see the guys finding a place to store the Ark. Pulls back, you see hundreds of these crates, and you think, what's in these? Like, it's one of those cliffhangers where you think, is this a cliffhanger? Like, are we going to find out what this place is? Like, what's going on?
Mm-hmm. And we never did.
It didn't pay off until Crystal Skull, but...
Which I think was a great cameo.
I think it was a great idea to bring that back. Mm-hmm. But yeah, and of course it leads into the Raiders March, and now I've kind of been... waiting to talk about this because this is the first time we get to talk about John Williams, who is the soundtrack god. There's nobody better than him.
In modern cinema, from like basically like I'd say the late 60s, even today, he's still doing amazing score pieces today. Like, no one does it better. Like, it's so hard. Like, there are other composers who can do like niche projects and do certain things really well. But when you want, like, grand epic scale, you go to John Williams.
And John Williams can tackle any genre. He proved it with Star Wars. He brought back the symphonic score. Really brought it back because of Star Wars. And this was in a period where he was on a absolute mean streak. Because he had started in the 60s scoring television. And he's won an Academy Award for adapting Fiddler on the Roof in 1971. But when he met up with Steven Spielberg, that really changed his career because, of course, he scored Jaws, and then he scored Star Wars, Close Encounters, Superman, and then Empire Strikes Back. He was just on this tear in Hollywood. He was winning Oscars, getting nominated for Oscars, and of course, much like Star Wars and Jaws, he came up with this brilliant theme, which is the Raiders March, and really, it's a perfect score. Mm-hmm. It's a perfect score. There's not one false note.
Yeah,
and like I said, part of it too is the mystery element of it, because he comes up with this theme for the Ark, and again, it starts very low in the beginning. It starts to build and build until that climactic scene where the orchestra just goes wild. It gets very big and very bombastic, but it's the perfect way to culminate the movie. And that's really what he does in a lot of his films. He starts off with a lead motif, and he builds on it throughout the film, and it comes in a big way at the climax usually.
Yeah, and it's just perfect. Like I said, there's not one bad note.
No, he really hit this one out of the park. Yeah. And of course, the Raiders March. Anybody who hears it, even if they haven't seen Indiana Jones, if they hear that theme, they know what it is. Mm-hmm. Again, the theme of this review is ubiquitous.
Yes. We're just going to title this podcast episode Ubiquitous.
Ubiquitous.
The Raiders of the Lost Ark review.
Raiders, the ubiquitous action film.
Yeah. And unlike last week where we had a lot of memorable lines review from Gangs in New York, this week, and this was one of the interesting things I found when rewatching this, is that this isn't really a quotable movie. There were a lot of great memorable scenes, moments, and points.
Yeah.
But there's actually not a bunch of quotes in here that I really could point to be like, oh yeah, that's from Raiders of the Lost Ark.
But there's a couple.
There's a couple.
There's a great one where they're explaining what the Ark is. It's a great expositional scene. They're explaining the Ark to the government agents and to us what this thing is capable of, and they show a picture in a big, heavy Bible that Indiana Jones just happens to be carrying around while he's at college, because of course he does. And
yeah, and the line goes, the government agent says, "My God."
And Marcus Brody Indy's friend says, "Yes, that's just what the Hebrews thought."
Yeah, it's a very foreboding line. It sets up perfectly. Like
it's funny, but it ties into the mystery of the Ark.
It's very witty. I think that a lot of the writing in this film is just witty. If I have to sum it up in one word.
That's what it is. It doesn't always stick out, but it's always just it's got kind of a flair. It's got a flair to it.
Yeah, it's got almost a sense of sass to it.
Yeah. That's true.
And there's a class line, "I hate snakes," or then the other one's like, "Snakes? Why'd it have to be snakes?"
Yeah, we find out in the beginning he says, "I hate snakes, Jock. I hate them."
Yeah, show a little backbone.
Yeah.
And then when they're getting the head piece of the staff of Raw inspected, the monkey dies, and Sonic catches the date for Indiana eats it. He says, "Bad dates."
Bad. Or even when they open the Well of the Souls, and after that shot where Spielberg loves doing this, he revels in this particular franchise. He revels in the creepy crawlies of the snakes.
Oh God!
And it really makes your skin crawl. I know some people like snakes. I don't have a particular affinity.
I don't care about them. I hate Temple of Doom when they have the bug scene. Ooh. Oh my God!
Or the rats in Last Crusade. They love this idea that Indy has to sift through these creepy crawlies to find what he has to find. But Indy just looks up, and it's almost, he plays it perfectly. It's not that kind of moment. He's just like, "Oh no."
Yeah.
He says, "Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?"
Then Saul goes, "That's very dangerous. You go first."
And Indy just looks. Indy just gives him a look like, "Me?"
It's like, are you freaking kidding me?
Yeah.
Why do I have to go first?
Yeah, there's just such great stuff, and even Belloc has a great line. We should mention Belloc a little bit because he is. Parker brought it up that he's very similar to Indiana Jones. They're both archaeologists. They both have a flair for the supernatural artifacts. But the difference between Indy and Belloc is Belloc really has no moral code.
Yeah. He's also a little more power hungry. Where Indy wants to do it to preserve history for the greatness it is.
Belloc wants the glory, and he says as much in that cafe scene. Mm-hmm. And he's also thoroughly as obsessed as Indy is with the Ark. But of course he decides to ally himself with the Nazis, and he basically has like a little tug of war with the Nazis, which is a really interesting thing.
It is, yeah. It's kind of
usually a villain would be like in the employ of the Nazis and be subservient, whereas this guy kind of throws his weight around a little bit.
Yeah, he bosses them around like they're his henchmen, which is very interesting.
Subversive.
Two other lines that really kind of stand out. After the plane fight scene, they reunite with Sala, and Sala asks, well, how are you going to get the truck back? And then he goes, I don't know.
I'm just making this up as I go.
Yeah. It's like a funny line. It's like, I guess it really is. I mean, I haven't thought about it until right now. It's like, he's just been going off the cuff of his sleeve for the entire time.
Yeah, that's kind of the movie in a nutshell. He kind of makes it up as he goes when he's presented with one situation after another situation. The pacing of the movie is really fast. He kind of has to literally jump from one situation out of another one. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when there are quiet moments, they're very well deserved.
Yeah,
like the scene between Marion and Indy on the boat, or digging for the Ark.
Yeah, and then I think in the tender scene in the boat with Marion, it's like, it's not the years, it's the mileage. It's another kind of great line of just
I think that was off the cuff from Harrison, or he improvised that with Steven, was that line. And this movie really was part of that time where they would take these genres, like the adventure genre, the sci-fi B movies, or even gangster films with The Godfather, and reshape them using modern sensibilities, reevaluating them and putting their own ideas into them. Mm-hmm. And this was a great example of two filmmakers combining to really make their mark on a genre that they love, pay tribute to it, and hopefully the audience would share that sentiment. And they did. The movie was a huge hit.
Yeah, it grossed like $400 million or something. It was like a huge sum.
Which wasn't as high necessarily as Star Wars, but it was pretty high.
Yeah, and this is also 1981. You think that
these are $1981.
Yeah, like I think if you accounted that for inflation, this is probably one of the top grossing. This is up there in like top 25 probably.
Yeah, but sadly, when I tell people that Raiders of the Lost Ark was nominated for Best Picture, everybody just kind of laughs, saying like, "You gotta be kidding," which kind of offends me because these kinds of movies are seen as trash by critics and even Academy members. Like, it's really hard to get this kind of movie to be nominated. But again, it seems so fresh and original that I think that's the reason why they nominated it. Plus, they played up a redemption arc for Spielberg. He got nominated for Best Director. Mm-hmm. Oddly enough, the screenplay didn't get nominated, which I can
see. Like I said, like it's not. It's the story itself is very good. The pacing is amazing. But I think if what this film did win for was editing, which the editing was amazing.
It won two sound Oscars, and it won for
special effects
and film editing. It got nominated for picture, director, cinematography, original score, which, going back to the 1982 Academy Awards, the big winner that year, the surprise upset was Chariots of Fire, which it's a good movie.
I haven't seen it.
I like it very much. You know, it's got a very ambitious agenda. It's a movie about Olympic runners, but they each have their own personal reasons. You know, very good thematic stuff, but. The one movie that was supposed to win all the Oscars that year was Warren Beatty's Reds, which I'm going to be honest, I don't like very much. I think that was one of the times Warren Beatty, who can be a very good director, kind of let loose a little too much, and the movie's all over the place. And this one, and On Golden Pond, which was a good movie with Henry Fonda and Katharine Hepburn and Jane Fonda. It was a really well-acted movie, but not Best Picture really caliber, I would say. Mm-hmm. And then you had this, and it was just, it was, honestly, I don't know if I would classify Raiders of the Lost Ark as Best Picture necessarily. That one's kind of tough.
Yeah, I think
But
even looking...
in terms of staying power and just how fresh it was, I probably would have given it to it because Chariots of Fire is very traditionally made, whereas this one is very non-traditional.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would give it Best Picture. Again, I haven't seen
and
all
it
the
also
movies.
and the composer of Chariots of Fire was Vangelis. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, if it's Vangelis or Vangelis. He won for, it's a very famous theme.
Yeah, the da da
Da
da
da da da da da.
Yeah, and it picks up pace. Yeah,
But yeah, it was a beautiful theme, and it was. I think the reason why it won was it was revolutionary for being a high caliber kind of art film scored with synthesizers, which really hadn't come into their own yet. So it sounded very new. Personally, I think Vangelis deserved an Oscar more for Blade Runner, which followed that year. But I don't know. The 1981 Oscars was interesting. You know, a lot of the winners were good. Only a few really weren't. I probably would have given John Williams the Oscar for this over Vangelis, but again, I think the novelty of what Vangelis did with Chariots of Fire is what won him the Oscar.
yeah.
But Williams didn't have much to worry about. He had won Oscars before, and the following year he won for E.T., which I don't think you've seen.
I don't think E.T. freaked me out as a kid. I didn't like it.
I think we got to put that on the list too. We got to revisit it.
Probably. I wish Xfinity would stop showing those damn E.T. commercials. They're getting really annoying.
Those are really annoying.
Yeah. So, kind of to sum it up, because we're going a little over an hour here.
Yeah, we want to be a little tighter.
Yeah. So, what about this movie made you want to talk about it? We were actually searching through on Netflix, just looking for films to watch, and this one came up, and you pointed to it and said, "That's what we're doing today. Like, that's the one."
Well, one of the things was we had just come off a big kind of portentous, not pretentious, but portentous film with Gangs of New York, and that one was very kind of Oscar movie kind of sprawling epic. Whereas this one, I think we just wanted to have a little fun, you know, watch a great action film, and we were debating whether or not we should watch Lethal Weapon or Spielberg's Duel. But then we were going through his Netflix and we saw this one. It was just like, that one.
Yeah.
Obviously.
It's, for me, Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's not my favorite Indiana Jones film. I love The Last Crusade more.
Yeah, personally, Last Crusade is my favorite, and that one is definitely all the indie films. What do you think? Should we put Crystal Skull on there? Is that one worthy of our time?
Don't put me in the spot like that. How dare you?
No, but just off the cuff, do you think it's worthy of our time? Or?
Not really.
So right now, it's just the quote unquote original trilogy.
Yeah. Like,
so
yeah, I like to believe it ended with the horses running off.
But we talked about, I think we chose this one because it just comes down to that simple feeling that it's fun to watch these films. These movies are such fun.
Yeah. And
they're so playful, and it's just a great thrill.
I think also, like, because I'm not a film student. Like, you were a film student in college. I wasn't. Like, you know a lot more, like, the technical side, like the second unit footage, the composition, like, all the stuff. But even me looking at this, I can see all of those mechanics going on, and it's not complicated. No. It's just done, really to the best of the ability, and it's just, it puts everything together so well. It puts the music together well. It puts the editing, the action, the adventure, the music, the direction, the cinematography, the setting. It's all there.
It's a very well-oiled machine, pretty much. And I don't want to be one of those pretentious film students that you often come across. Like, I know how to have fun in a movie, and even this one, knowing everything I know, and always wanting to learn tidbits about how a film's made, like what cameras they used or how they did it. It still is born out of the fact that I love this movie. It's so much fun to watch. I still get butterflies in my stomach when Harrison's on the front of the truck and he crawls under, and it's still one of those movies that works. It works, and it's, again, I think it still speaks to the child in me, like wanting to go on this big adventure and fight the bad guys, get the girl, get the treasure. I think that's really what it boils down to. It's a little kids movie that anybody can enjoy.
Yeah, and it will last. Like, it's been out for 40 years. It'll last another 400. I think
people still talk about Indiana Jones, and Disney's going to produce a fifth one. Spielberg's coming back.
I don't know how I feel about a fifth
Ford's
one.
coming back. I'm sure some of you will find this to be happy news. Apparently, George isn't involved, which I still feel really weird about, especially with this franchise, to not have him as part of it.
We'll get into all like the Disney
we'll
stuff
get into
one
that.
day. Yeah.
But yeah, Raiders of the Lost Ark is one of those great staples, ubiquitous films, and 9.5 out of 10 for me. It's still fun after all these years.
I would agree with that. Like not either like 9 out of 10 or 9.5. It's hard to look at this film and find things like there are like kind of like tropes and like stereotypes that like we can make fun of. But this film did it first. It did it so well that even when you make fun of them, you still realize the greatness of it. So I'm in complete agreement with you.
Yeah.
So I think that'll do it for this week's podcast. Thank you for listening. Once again, I'm Parker Glazner.
I'm Jim Crowley.
And thank you for listening to Jim and Parker's excellent podcast.
Totally, dude.